Sherlock Holmes and the Ghosts of Tower Bridge, a cosy London fog sleep story. Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening, where we gather to let the cares of the day dissolve like mist over the Thames. Tonight, I invite you to journey with me into the heart of Victorian London, where gaslight flickers against cobblestones and mysteries drift through the fog like whispered secrets. This is a tale designed to carry you gently towards sleep, to slow your thoughts and ease your mind into peaceful rest. There is no urgency here, no need to rush. Simply allow the story to wash over you like a warm tide, carrying you deeper into comfort with each passing moment. Before we begin, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? What distant corner of the world has brought you here to this fireside gathering? Take a slow breath with me now, in through your nose and out through your mouth. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day settle away from you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. It was November in London, that particular kind of November evening when the fog rolls in from the river like a living thing, curling around lampposts and sliding beneath doorways with patient insistence. The year was 1891, and at 221 B. Baker Street, a fire burned steadily in the grate, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with books and scientific instruments. The rain had begun just after tea time, a gentle, persistent drumming against the window panes that created the most soothing rhythm, a metronome for thought, a lullaby for the restless mind. Sherlock Holmes sat in his favoured armchair, the one positioned perfectly between the hearth and the window, allowing him to observe both the flames and the street below. He had been silent for nearly an hour, his long fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, his grey eyes focused on some invisible point in the middle distance. The firelight caught the angles of his lean face, illuminating the high cheekbones and aquiline nose that gave him such a distinctive profile. A pipe rested forgotten in the ashtray beside him, sending up the occasional lazy curl of smoke that mingled with the scent of burning oak and the faint must of old paper. Dr. John Watson sat across from him, attempting to read the evening newspaper, but finding his attention drawn repeatedly to his friend's unusual stillness. Watson had known Holmes for many years now, had witnessed countless moods and manifestations of that brilliant, restless mind, but there was something different about tonight's silence. It was not the electric tension that preceded the solving of a complex case, nor the melancholic withdrawal that sometimes overtook the detective when London's criminal element proved disappointingly mundane. No, this was something else entirely, a watchful waiting, as if Holmes were listening for something just beyond the reach of ordinary hearing. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with steady reassurance, its brass face reflecting the firelight. Watson turned a page of his newspaper, the crisp rustle seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Outside, a carriage passed along Baker Street, its wheels splashing through puddles, the driver's call to his horses muffled by the fog and rain. Somewhere in the building, Mrs. Hudson moved about her kitchen, the faint clink of china and the whisper of her footsteps on the stairs below, providing the comfortable soundtrack of domestic routine. "Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice low and measured, breaking the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "What do you make of ghosts?" Watson looked up from his paper, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Ghosts?" he repeated, carefully folding the newspaper and setting it aside. I should think you know my opinion well enough, Holmes. As a medical man, I confine my beliefs to what can be observed and measured. The supernatural, in my experience, generally proves to have a quite natural explanation upon closer examination. A faint smile touched Holmes's lips. Admirably rational, as always, my dear fellow. And yet, he unfolded himself from his chair with that peculiar grace he possessed, moving to stand before the window. The rain traced silver rivers down the glass, distorting the gaslight outside into golden smears. And yet, what are we to make of phenomena that defy conventional explanation? Not the crude fabrications of spiritualist mediums or the hysterical imaginings of the credulous, but genuine mysteries that resist the application of logic. Before Watson could formulate a response, the sound of footsteps ascending the stairs reached their ears. Quick, urgent steps that spoke of purpose and agitation. Mrs. Hudson's knock came moments later, firm but respectful. "Mr. Holmes, there is a gentleman to see you. He says it is most urgent and will not wait until morning." Holmes turned from the window, and Watson caught the flash of interest in his eyes, that sudden sharpening of attention that indicated the game was afoot. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, if you please." The visitor who entered their sitting room brought with him the scent of fog and river water, his overcoat glistening with rain. He was a man in his middle 50s, solidly built, with a face that spoke of both authority and deep concern. His clothes were well tailored, but showed the wear of a long day, and his hands, when he removed his gloves, trembled slightly. Whether from cold or emotion, Watson could not immediately determine. "Mr. Holmes," the man began without preamble, his voice carrying the refined accent of education, tempered by years of practical experience. "I am James Cartwright, Chief Engineer for Tower Bridge. I come to you because I quite literally have nowhere else to turn, and I fear my sanity may be at stake." Holmes gestured to the chair Watson had vacated, moving instead to lean against the mantelpiece, his posture relaxed, but his attention focused entirely on their visitor. "Please, Mr. Cartwright, sit. Mrs. Hudson will bring tea momentarily. You are cold and agitated. Warm yourself by our fire, and tell us what brings you to Baker Street at this late hour." Cartwright sank into the chair with evident relief, extending his hands toward the welcoming flames. Watson took up position near the bookshelf, his medical instincts noting the signs of exhaustion in their visitor's face, the dark circles beneath his eyes, the tension held in his shoulders. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and the fire crackled softly, sending up small showers of sparks that disappeared into the chimney's darkness. "I hardly know where to begin," Cartwright said, accepting the cup of tea that Mrs. Hudson brought up, wrapping his hands around it as if drawing strength from its warmth. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes, I am not a fanciful man. I have spent my career building bridges, working with iron and steel and stone, with things that can be measured and calculated. I do not believe in spirits or spectres, and yet—" He paused, taking a slow sip of his tea, gathering himself. Holmes waited with that particular patience he employed when drawing out a witness, saying nothing, simply allowing the silence to encourage continuation. Watson noticed how the firelight played across the detective's face, creating a study in shadow and light that might have been painted by a master. "For the past 3 weeks," Cartwright continued, his voice steadier now, "there have been disturbances at Tower Bridge. It began with sounds. Footsteps in empty corridors within the towers, the sound of machinery operating in the night when all is locked and secured. My night watchman reported these incidents, and at first I dismissed them as the settling of the structure, the expansion and contraction of metal with temperature changes. The bridge is massive, after all, and new enough that such sounds might be expected. He set down his teacup with a soft clink against the saucer, his hands no longer trembling. But then the sightings began. 3 different men, reliable workers all, have reported seeing figures moving in the upper walkways, the high-level pedestrian passages that connect the 2 towers. These figures appear at night, visible against the moonlight when the fog permits, walking slowly along the glass-enclosed walkways. But when we investigate, there is no one there. The walkways are locked from the inside, accessible only with keys that remain in my possession. Before we fall asleep tonight, write in the comments what time it is for you and where you are from. Watson found himself leaning forward, drawn into the mystery despite his rational inclinations. Could these be reflections? He suggested. The glass in such structures might create optical illusions, particularly at night. That was my first thought as well, Doctor, Cartwright replied, nodding gratefully at this prosaic explanation. But last night... He paused again, and Watson saw genuine fear flicker across the man's features. Last night, I remained at the bridge myself, determined to observe these phenomena firsthand. I positioned myself in the southern tower at a vantage point where I could watch both walkways clearly. The fog had lifted, and the moon was nearly full, providing excellent visibility. The fire shifted in the grate, a log rolling slightly and sending up a fresh display of embers. Holmes remained motionless, his eyes never leaving their visitor's face, reading every nuance of expression and gesture, with that uncanny ability to extract meaning from the smallest details. At precisely midnight, Cartwright continued, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. I saw them. Not one figure, but 3, moving in single file along the western walkway. They were clearly human in shape, wearing what appeared to be workman's clothes of an older style. They moved slowly, purposefully, and as I watched, they reached the center point of the walkway and simply vanished. Not departed through a door, Mr. Holmes. They faded like smoke, becoming transparent, and then nothing at all. The room fell silent, except for the rain and the fire. Watson felt the hair rise slightly on the back of his neck, that primitive response to tales of the uncanny that no amount of medical training could entirely suppress. Holmes, however, showed no such reaction. Instead, he moved to his desk, lighting a fresh pipe with a taper from the fire, the small ritual of tobacco preparation, providing a moment of contemplation. Most intriguing, Holmes murmured, the pipe smoke curling around his face. Tell me, Mr. Cartwright, what do you know of the bridge's construction history? Were there accidents during the building? Deaths, perhaps? Cartwright nodded slowly. As with any major construction project, there were incidents. Several men died during the 8 years of building. Falls mostly, and one drowning when a caisson flooded. But that was years ago, and such tragedies, while deeply regrettable, are not uncommon in work of this magnitude. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, moving to stand before the window once more, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street. The gaslight below cast his shadow long across the floor, merging with the shadows thrown by the fireplace, creating a play of darkness and light that seemed to embody the mystery itself. "I shall take your case, Mr. Cartwright," Holmes said at last, turning back to face the room. "Watson and I will visit Tower Bridge tomorrow evening, if that is convenient. I should like to examine these walkways in daylight first, to understand the physical space, and then remain through the night to observe any phenomena that may manifest. In the meantime, I recommend you get some rest. You look exhausted, and tired minds are prone to seeing patterns where none exist, though I suspect, in this case, there is indeed a pattern to be found." Relief washed visibly across Cartwright's features. He rose, shaking Holmes's hand with renewed energy, then Watson's. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I cannot express what comfort it brings to know that you will investigate this matter. Whatever the explanation, natural or otherwise, I must have it for the peace of mind of my workers and, I confess, for my own sanity." After their visitor had departed, his footsteps receding down the stairs and into the rainy night, Watson turned to find Holmes already deep in thought, standing before the bookshelves, his fingers trailing along the spines of volumes dealing with engineering, architecture, and the history of London. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Watson asked, resuming his seat by the fire. Holmes pulled down a thick volume, flipping through its pages with practiced efficiency. "I make of it that Tower Bridge, that magnificent monument to modern engineering, holds a secret. And secrets, my dear Watson, are simply truths waiting to be illuminated by the proper application of observation and reason. Ghost stories are often the most fascinating cases, for they require us to look beyond the supernatural explanation and discover the very human truth beneath." The fire burned low. The rain continued its gentle song against the windows, and somewhere in the darkness of London, Tower Bridge stood silent and watchful over the Thames, keeping its secrets close as the fog rolled in from the river, wrapping the great towers in mystery and shadow, crafting Part Two's unique opening and narrative flow. Morning arrived softly over Baker Street, the rain having ceased sometime in the small hours, leaving behind a London washed clean and glistening. Watson woke to the sound of Holmes moving about their sitting room, with that particular energy that indicated his mind had been working through the night, assembling and reassembling the pieces of a puzzle. Pale November light filtered through the curtains, and the scent of strong coffee drifted up from Mrs. Hudson's kitchen, mixing with the lingering smell of pipe tobacco and old books that seemed permanently woven into the fabric of their rooms. By the time Watson had dressed and descended, he found Holmes already at the breakfast table, surrounded by a collection of books and newspapers. Several maps of London spread before him like a general planning a campaign. The detective looked remarkably fresh, despite what had clearly been a night of minimal sleep, his eyes bright with that focused intensity that came when a case captured his full attention. "Ah, Watson," Holmes greeted him, gesturing to the coffee pot. "I trust you slept well. I have been doing some preliminary research into our bridge and its history. Fascinating structure, really. Did you know that the high-level walkways, the very location of our mysterious apparitions, were originally intended as a primary pedestrian crossing? The public could ascend the towers and cross high above the Thames without waiting for the bascules to lower. Quite innovative for its time." Watson poured himself coffee, the rich aroma providing a gentle awakening for his senses. He settled into his chair, accepting a piece of toast from the rack Mrs. Hudson had sent up. Outside their window, London was beginning its daily routines. The clip-clop of horses pulling delivery wagons, the distant call of a flower seller, the gentle murmur of the city coming to life. And these walkways are no longer in regular use, he asked, spreading marmalade with careful attention. Precisely the point, Holmes replied, tapping a finger against one of the maps. They closed to the public in 1895, though we are still in 91, so they remain operational. However, I have learned through some inquiries this morning that they are little used. The public prefers to wait for the bridge to lower rather than climb the towers. This means the walkways spend most of their time empty, locked, accessible only to maintenance workers and engineers. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, an ideal location for activities one wishes to keep private. Around midday, a telegram arrived from Cartwright, confirming their visit for that evening and providing details about access to the bridge. Holmes read it aloud, his voice carrying that particular satisfaction that came from a plan falling into place. He will meet us at 7 o'clock at the southern tower entrance. The bridge will be closed to general traffic for routine maintenance, convenient for our purposes, as it will allow us to explore without interruption. The afternoon drifted by with surprising tranquility. Holmes spent time in what he called mental preparation, sitting by the window with his eyes closed, his breathing slow and regular, building that internal catalogue of relevant knowledge and observation that made him such a formidable investigator. Watson wrote up notes from a previous case, the scratch of his pen providing a gentle rhythmic accompaniment to the ticking of the clock and the occasional crackle from the rebuilt fire. As the short November day began to fade, they prepared for their expedition. Holmes selected a dark coat and ensured his pocket torch was functioning properly. Watson, with his military experience, brought his service revolver, though he suspected, as he always did in Holmes's cases, that the solution would prove to be rooted in human ingenuity, rather than danger requiring firearms. Still, the weight of it in his pocket provided a certain reassurance as they descended to the street and hailed a hansom cab. The drive through London took them eastward, through streets that grew progressively older and more labyrinthine as they approached the river. The gaslight was being lit as they travelled, each lamp flaring to life as the lamplighters made their rounds, creating chains of golden light stretching into the gathering dusk. The cab wheels rattled over cobblestones, the rhythm hypnotic and steady, while around them the great city transformed from day to night, shops closing their shutters, taverns lighting their windows, the whole massive organism of London shifting from one state to another. The Thames appeared before them quite suddenly, a dark ribbon reflecting the first stars beginning to emerge in the clearing sky. And there, rising like a Gothic cathedral of iron and stone, stood Tower Bridge, magnificent and somehow brooding, its twin towers silhouetted against the deepening blue of twilight. The structure seemed to hold itself with a particular dignity, aware of its own importance, the symbolic gateway to the heart of the Empire's commercial power. Their cab drew to a halt at the southern approach, and as they alighted, Watson felt the temperature drop noticeably. The river carried with it a chill that penetrated heavy coats, a damp cold that spoke of deep water and ancient currents. The bridge itself seemed to radiate a presence, not menacing exactly, but substantial, a thing of weight and consequence that dominated the landscape around it. Cartwright emerged from a small door at the base of the southern tower, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows across the stonework. He looked, if possible, even more exhausted than the night before, his face drawn with worry and lack of sleep. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. I have cleared the bridge of all workers as requested. We have complete privacy for your investigation." Holmes shook the engineer's hand, his keen eyes already scanning the tower's exterior, noting the placement of windows, the arrangement of the stonework, the various access points, and architectural details. "Excellent, Mr. Cartwright. I should like to begin with a thorough examination of the walkways themselves, in what remains of the daylight. Then we shall position ourselves for observation once darkness falls completely." They entered the tower through the maintenance door, stepping into a world of stone and iron, of spiral staircases that wound upward into shadow. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the enclosed space, each step creating ripples of sound that climbed ahead of them. Cartwright led the way with his lantern, its light sliding across walls of dressed stone, across metal railings worn smooth by countless hands, across landings where small windows looked out over the darkening river. The climb was substantial, taking them up through the very heart of the tower. Watson found himself counting steps, a habit from his military days, and had reached 170 before they emerged onto a landing that opened into the western walkway. Here, suddenly, the space transformed. Where the tower had been all stone and shadow, the walkway was largely glass and light, an enclosed corridor stretching across the void between the towers, suspended high above the Thames. The view was extraordinary. Through the glass panels, they could see the river spreading out below them like a dark mirror, dotted with the lights of boats and barges. To the east, the Tower of London crouched like an ancient beast, its walls holding centuries of history within their embrace. To the west, London stretched away into the gathering night, a constellation of lights marking streets and squares, theatres and homes, the vast breathing organism of the greatest city in the world. Holmes moved along the walkway with careful deliberation, his torch beam playing across every surface. He examined the floor, bare metal panels showing the engineering beneath the public facade. He studied the glass enclosures, testing them for stability, checking the sealant around the frames. He inspected the metal framework that supported the entire structure, running his fingers along joins and rivets with the concentration of a surgeon exploring a wound. Watson followed at a respectful distance, watching his friend work, noting the thoroughness of the examination. Cartwright stood near the tower entrance, his lantern held steady, his face a study in anxious hope. The wind outside picked up slightly, creating a low moaning sound as it passed through the gaps in the structure. Not frightening exactly, but certainly atmospheric, a reminder that they stood suspended above the river, enclosed in glass and iron, separated from the solid earth by empty air and engineering confidence. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, crouching to examine a particular section of flooring near the walkway's center point, precisely where Cartwright had reported seeing the figures vanish. He produced a magnifying glass from his coat pocket, studying something Watson could not see from his position. The detective's face was intent, absorbed, lost in that particular realm of observation where tiny details spoke volumes to his trained perception. At that moment, a sound reached them from deep within the northern tower, a heavy metallic clang, like a door slamming shut. followed by what might have been footsteps echoing up through the tower's interior spaces. All three men froze, Watson's hand instinctively moving toward his pocket where the revolver rested. Cartwright's face went pale, his lantern wavering slightly. The sound came again, definitely footsteps now, ascending the spiral stair within the opposite tower, drawing steadily closer to the walkway's northern entrance. Holmes straightened slowly, his expression interested rather than alarmed, his eyes fixed on the dark opening at the far end of the glass corridor. The footsteps continued their steady climb, growing louder with each passing moment, accompanied now by what sounded like the rustle of heavy fabric, the breathing of someone engaged in strenuous physical effort. The walkway seemed to grow colder, though Watson could not be certain if this was actual temperature change or merely the effect of anticipation and the growing darkness outside. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. There was a moment of absolute silence, profound and complete, broken only by the wind outside and the distant sound of the river below. Then, quite clearly, they heard the creak of the door at the northern entrance beginning to open, the hinges protesting with a long, drawn-out groan that seemed to fill the entire walkway with sound. The door swung wider, darkness beyond, and Holmes took a step forward, his torch raised, ready to illuminate whatever emerged from that shadowed opening into their glass-enclosed corridor, suspended high above the Thames. A cat emerged from the darkness, a large tabby with luminous eyes that reflected Holmes's torchlight like twin moons. It paused in the doorway, regarding them with that supreme indifference possessed only by felines, then proceeded to walk calmly across the glass-enclosed walkway, its tail held high, its paws making no sound whatsoever on the metal floor. The animal reached the midpoint of the corridor, sat down precisely where Holmes had been examining the floor, and began to wash its face with methodical attention, completely unconcerned by the three men watching its performance. Watson released a breath he had not realized he was holding, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. Cartwright let out a nervous laugh, the sound echoing strangely in the enclosed space. But Holmes remained motionless, his torch still trained on the walkway, his eyes not on the cat, but on something beyond it, through the glass walls, out into the darkening London sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost dreamy in its contemplation. "Curious," he said softly, moving forward with slow steps, not wishing to disturb the cat, which had now stretched itself out in a patch of fading light from the western windows. "Mr. Cartwright, you mentioned that these walkways remain locked at all times. Yet this creature has clearly made itself quite at home here. How would it have gained access?" Cartwright moved closer, his lantern light joining Holmes's torch to illuminate the tabby, which had rolled onto its back in a display of complete contentment. I cannot explain it, Mr. Holmes. The doors should be secured. We check them daily as part of our maintenance routine. And yet..." He trailed off, his confusion evident. Holmes knelt beside the cat, which deigned to allow him to scratch behind its ears, purring with a sound like distant thunder. The detective's fingers explored the creature's collar, a simple leather affair with a small brass tag that caught the light. He turned the tag over, reading the inscription with his torch held close. "Archimedes," he read aloud, "resident of number 4, Irongate Wharf. Our friend here lives some distance from Tower Bridge. Quite the journey for a casual visit." The cat, as if understanding it had been discovered, rose with fluid grace and padded toward the northern tower entrance, disappearing once more into the shadows from which it had emerged. Holmes rose to follow, and Watson found himself trailing after, Cartwright bringing up the rear with his lantern swinging gentle arcs of light across the stone walls. They descended the northern tower's spiral stairs, the steps worn smooth by decades of use, each footfall creating soft echoes that spiraled downward ahead of them like ghostly predecessors. At the tower's base, Holmes pushed open a small maintenance door that led to the exterior walkway along the Thames. The evening air greeted them with that particular bite that comes with November twilight by the river. Sharp, clean, carrying the scent of water and old stone, and the faint industrial perfume of coal smoke from countless chimneys across the city. The cat had vanished into the gathering darkness, but Holmes stood for a long moment, his sharp eyes scanning the riverbank, the wharves, the maze of streets and alleys that crowded up to the water's edge. "There," he said at last, pointing with his torch toward a narrow passageway between two warehouses. A network of spaces beneath the bridge approaches, service tunnels for maintenance access, storm drains, perhaps storage areas for construction materials left over from the building. Our feline friend knows routes through this structure that official plans may not document, and if a cat can find its way in, so too can a person of determination and modest size. Watson peered into the darkness where Holmes indicated, seeing nothing but shadow and the faint gleam of water from puddles left by the morning's rain. Yet he knew better than to doubt his friend's observations. Holmes had a gift for seeing what others missed, for reading the landscape of a place as others might read a book, finding meaning in details that appeared insignificant to ordinary perception. They returned to the bridge interior, climbing once more to the walkway level. But this time, Holmes led them through a different route, a service corridor that ran parallel to the public spaces, narrow and utilitarian, where the true skeleton of the bridge showed itself in bare rivets and exposed framework. Here, the sounds of the structure were more apparent. The faint groaning of metal adjusting to temperature changes, the whisper of wind through gaps and joints, the deep, almost subliminal rumble of the river flowing far below, transmitted through stone and iron like the heartbeat of some sleeping giant. Holmes's torch played across walls and floor, seeking and finding small details, scuff marks on the metal, disturbed dust, a cigarette end that still carried a faint scent of Turkish tobacco. He collected this last item carefully in a small envelope from his pocket, handling it with the reverence one might afford a precious relic. "Someone has been here recently," he murmured, more to himself than to his companions. "Within the last day, I should say. A working man, given the roughness of the tobacco, but one who can afford a better quality than most labourers smoke. Interesting." They emerged into the eastern walkway, the twin of the corridor where they had first encountered the cat. Here, the light was nearly gone. The river below transformed into a sheet of darkness, broken only by the scattered lights of vessels, making their way up and down the Thames. The city's electric lights were beginning to dominate now, that modern brilliance that was slowly replacing the softer glow of gas, creating new patterns of illumination that changed the very character of London after dark. At a small landing where the walkway met the tower, Holmes discovered something that caused him to emit a low sound of satisfaction. He beckoned Watson and Cartwright closer, directing their attention to a small panel in the wall, a maintenance access point, its screws recently disturbed, fine metal shavings visible on the floor beneath it. With careful movements, Holmes removed the panel, revealing a space beyond, a cavity in the tower's structure where cables and pipes ran between floors. Large enough for a person to navigate, Holmes observed, his torch illuminating the cramped passage, leading down toward the machinery chambers below, if I am not mistaken. Mr. Cartwright, your bridge is rather more porous than you imagined. Someone, perhaps several someones, has been using these hidden routes to move through the structure unseen. A gust of wind struck the glass walls of the walkway, causing them to flex slightly, with a sound like a great sail catching the breeze. Outside, clouds were moving in from the east, obscuring the stars that had begun to emerge, promising more rain before morning. The temperature continued to drop, and Watson found himself grateful for his heavy coat. Though he noticed Holmes seemed entirely unaffected by the cold, his attention focused wholly on the mystery unfolding before them. They settled into a position of observation as full darkness claimed the bridge. Cartwright had brought blankets and a flask of hot tea, which they shared in the quiet comfort of companionable watchfulness. The engineer had also thought to bring sandwiches, simple fare of cheese and pickle, wrapped in paper, that rustled softly when opened. They ate without speaking, three men suspended between earth and sky, between the river and the stars, waiting for whatever the night might reveal. The city sounds drifted up to them in a gentle symphony, the distant clang of a railway yard, the muffled sound of voices from a passing boat, the melancholy call of a train whistle somewhere to the north. Holmes sat perfectly still beside a window, positioned so he could observe both walkways, while remaining largely invisible to anyone who might enter. Watson took up a position near the southern tower entrance, his back against the cool stone, the weight of his revolver a steady presence against his side. Cartwright, exhausted by days of worry and sleeplessness, dozed fitfully in a corner, his lantern turned low, but ready to be raised should it be needed. An hour passed, measured by the distant chiming of clock towers across London, each bell adding its voice to the chorus of time's passage. Watson found his thoughts drifting in that pleasant way that comes with stillness and patience, his mind wandering through memories and observations, connected by threads of association that seemed both random and meaningful. He thought of other nights spent in watchfulness, during the war in Afghanistan, on guard duty under foreign stars, and later on numerous cases with Holmes, waiting for criminals or witnesses, or the revelation of truths hidden in darkness. At 10:30, Holmes raised a hand, a gesture of alert attention that brought Watson immediately to full awareness. The detective had heard something, some disturbance in the pattern of normal sounds that made up the bridge's nighttime voice. Watson strained his ears, but could detect nothing unusual, only the wind, the river, the distant city sounds that had been there all along. Yet he trusted Holmes's senses, honed by years of observation and practice, sensitive to gradations of sound and movement that ordinary perception missed. Then he heard it too, a soft metallic scraping from somewhere below them, in the depths of the southern tower. Not the random settling of the structure, but purposeful sound, the sound of metal against metal, perhaps a tool working at a lock or bolt. The scraping continued for several moments, then ceased abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it seemed to have texture and weight, pressing it against their eardrums like deep water. Footsteps began, slow, careful, ascending the spiral stair within the tower. Not the casual steps of a guard making rounds, but cautious progress. The measured pace of someone who did not wish to be heard, yet could not entirely eliminate the sound of their movement. Watson rose silently to his feet, his hand moving to his revolver. Cartwright had awakened and sat frozen, his eyes wide in the dim light from the shuttered lantern. Holmes remained in his position by the window, motionless as a statue, only his eyes showing the intensity of his concentration. The footsteps reached the landing just below the walkway entrance. There was a pause, a moment of stillness, then a sound Watson recognized from long experience. The striking of a match, brief and sharp, followed by the warm smell of sulphur and burning tobacco. Someone was lighting a cigarette or pipe, standing just out of sight in the tower's darkness, gathering themselves before continuing, pacing and plot advancement. The flame from the match flickered and died, leaving only the faint red glow of burning tobacco visible in the darkness of the stairwell. Holmes moved then with that sudden decisiveness that characterized his actions when the moment for observation had passed and the time for engagement had arrived. He stepped forward into the walkway, his torch beam cutting through the shadows, illuminating the entrance where the mysterious visitor would momentarily appear. What emerged into the light was not a spectre or a mysterious figure cloaked in supernatural menace, but rather a man of perhaps 30 years, dressed in the practical clothing of a tradesman. Heavy canvas trousers, a thick wool jacket, boots worn but well maintained. He carried a leather satchel over one shoulder and held a pipe between his teeth, from which the sweet smoke of quality tobacco curled upward in lazy spirals. His face registered surprise at finding the walkway occupied, but not fear or guilt. Rather, the slightly sheepish expression of someone caught somewhere they perhaps should not be, but who had reasons they considered legitimate. "Good evening," Holmes said, his voice carrying neither accusation nor threat, merely polite inquiry. "Rather late for bridge maintenance, I should think, though I observe from the plaster dust on your boots and the architectural drawings protruding from your satchel that you are not, in fact, a maintenance worker at all, but rather a surveyor or perhaps a draftsman engaged in documenting this structure." The man removed his pipe, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, despite his evident discomfort at being discovered. "You would be Sherlock Holmes, I take it. I have read of your methods in the newspapers. Yes, I am a draftsman, Thomas Millwright by name. I work for the architectural firm that designed these towers. Or rather, I worked for them. I was dismissed 3 months ago due to financial difficulties within the company." He stepped fully into the walkway, setting down his satchel with a soft thud that echoed in the glass-enclosed space. Outside, the clouds had thickened, obscuring the moon entirely now, and the first drops of new rain began to patter against the windows. That most soothing of sounds, the gentle percussion that speaks of shelter and safety when one is warm and dry within walls. I have been coming here at night to complete the detail work on the bridge documentation, measurements and drawings that were left unfinished when I was let go. I know it is trespassing, Mr. Holmes, but this bridge is my life's work, or at least part of it, and I could not bear to see the documentation incomplete. Cartwright had risen and come forward, his lantern raised, his face showing recognition. "Millwright, yes, I remember you. You were here during the final months of construction, always sketching, always measuring, but you cannot simply enter the bridge whenever you please. The security is rather less thorough than you might imagine. Millwright interrupted gently, without rancour. I know this structure intimately, Mr. Cartwright. I know every access point, every service corridor, every maintenance shaft and drainage tunnel. I have been careful to cause no harm, to disturb nothing. I simply come, do my work, and leave again before dawn. Holmes had been listening with that particular quality of attention that indicated his mind was processing information at multiple levels simultaneously. Now he moved to examine Millwright's satchel, receiving a nod of permission before opening it to reveal not tools of sabotage or theft, but rather the implements of an artist and technician. Fine pencils, rulers, a T-square, rolls of paper covered in meticulous architectural drawings showing the bridge from every conceivable angle and in extraordinary detail. Beautiful work, Holmes murmured, unrolling one of the drawings carefully, his torch illuminating the precise lines and careful notations. You have captured not merely the physical structure, but something of its character, its presence. This is the work of someone who loves buildings, who sees them not as mere arrangements of stone and iron, but as entities with personality and significance. Watson moved closer to examine the drawings, struck by their beauty, the way they transformed engineering into art, showing the bridge in cross-section and elevation, in detail and in grand overview. Millwright had included small touches that transcended pure documentation, the way light would fall through the glass walkways, the relationship between the Gothic styling of the towers and the medieval fortress they were designed to complement, the mathematical elegance of the bascule mechanism that allowed the bridge to open for river traffic. But you are not the only person who has been entering the bridge at night, Holmes continued, setting down the drawings with care. You have seen the others, have you not? That is why you smoke Turkish tobacco now, when your preferred blend, judging by the stains on your pipe, is a Virginia mixture. You have been trying to mask your scent, to make yourself less detectable to whoever else moves through these towers in darkness. Millwright's composure faltered slightly, and he took a long draw on his pipe before responding, the tobacco glowing bright red in the darkness, casting momentary warmth across his features. I have seen shadows, heard voices. At first, I thought I was imagining things, the product of working late and alone in such a place. But over the past 2 weeks, I have become certain there are others here. They move through the lower chambers, the machinery spaces where the hydraulic systems operate the bascules. I have heard them speaking, though I could never make out the words. And once, he paused, seeming to gather his courage. Once, I saw 3 men in the western walkway, just as you are here now, examining something on the floor. They wore workman's clothing, but something about them seemed wrong, out of place. When they became aware of my presence, they vanished, simply disappeared into the tower, moving with a speed and silence that seemed almost impossible. The rain intensified, drumming now against the glass walls with greater insistence, creating a sound like thousands of tiny fingers tapping, seeking entrance, the voice of the weather making its presence known. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out over the rain-swept Thames, his reflection ghostly in the glass, superimposed over the darkness of the river and the scattered lights of the city beyond. When he spoke, his voice carried that particular tone that indicated he was fitting pieces together, constructing a framework of understanding from scattered fragments of information. "A pattern emerges," he said softly, "a bridge that is both more accessible and more secretive than it appears. Hidden routes known to those who built it or studied it intimately. Nocturnal visitors with purposes they wish to conceal. And at the center of it all, these walkways, designed as public thoroughfares, but little used, essentially abandoned spaces, suspended high above the city, perfect for activities requiring both proximity to the bridge proper and relative security from observation." A sound reached them then from far below, not footsteps this time, but the deep mechanical groan of the bridge's bascule mechanism beginning to operate. The massive counterweights, each weighing hundreds of tons, were moving, the hydraulic rams extending, the great arms of the bridge beginning their stately rise to allow a vessel to pass beneath. The sound filled the entire structure, a rumbling vibration that they felt in their bones as much as heard, the voice of the bridge itself awakening from stillness into motion. "But the bridge is closed tonight," Cartwright said, his voice rising with alarm. "I gave explicit orders. No ships were to be permitted passage. The bridge should not be opening." Holmes was already moving, heading for the stairs that led down into the southern tower, taking them with remarkable speed, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Watson followed, his military training keeping him steady on the spiral descent, while Cartwright and Millwright brought up the rear, their lanterns creating dancing shadows that seemed to chase them downward through the tower's heart. They emerged into the machinery chamber, a vast space filled with the hydraulic equipment that powered the bridge's operation. Here, the sound was deafening, the massive pistons and rams moving with inexorable force, ancient and powerful, the beating heart of this iron giant. Steam hissed from release valves, and the smell of hot oil and metal filled the air, sharp and industrial, overlaying the ever-present scent of the river. Through the windows of the chamber, they could see the bascules rising, the roadway that normally lay flat across the Thames, now lifting skyward like great arms raised in salutation or surrender. The counterweights descended into their pits with the slow majesty of geological processes. Tons of concrete and iron moving with precision and control despite their massive weight. And below, passing through the opening channel, a vessel moved. But it was not some tall-masted ship requiring clearance, not a cargo vessel or passenger steamer. It was a small steam launch, barely large enough to require the bridge to open at all, moving swiftly upriver, showing no lights, a shadow on the dark water. Watson caught only a glimpse of it before it disappeared beneath the bridge's span and continued upstream. But in that brief moment, he saw that it rode low in the water, as if heavily laden, and that several figures stood in its stern, looking back at the bridge they had just passed beneath. Holmes stood at the chamber window, watching the launch disappear into the rainy darkness, his face illuminated by the glow from the machinery gauges and pressure indicators that lined the walls. When he turned back to face the others, his expression was one of grim satisfaction, the look of a hunter who has finally caught the scent of his quarry. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the mechanical roar, "we are not dealing with ghosts or supernatural phenomena. We are dealing with something far more prosaic and far more serious. A smuggling operation using Tower Bridge as both passage and storage facility. The apparitions that have been seen in the walkways are guards or lookouts, ensuring the coast is clear for their activities below. And tonight, we have witnessed a delivery, or perhaps a retrieval, something important enough to risk opening the bridge illegally to expedite its transportation. The machinery began to slow as the bascules reached their full height, the grinding and groaning diminishing gradually until they stood once more in relative silence. Only the drip of condensation and the hiss of releasing steam providing soft counterpoint to the rain outside. Millwright had grown pale, understanding now that his innocent documentation of the bridge had inadvertently placed him in proximity to criminal activity. Cartwright looked stricken, the realization that his bridge, his life's professional achievement, was being exploited for illicit purposes, clearly weighing heavily upon him. What were they transporting? Watson asked, knowing the question was likely premature, but needing to give voice to the inquiry nonetheless. Holmes smiled, that tight expression that indicated the game was truly afoot now, the intellectual challenge fully engaged. That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must discover. But I suspect, given the elaborate nature of their operation and the risks they are willing to take, that we are dealing with items of considerable value, items that cannot be moved through normal channels without attracting unwanted attention. We must examine the lower chambers more thoroughly, but not tonight. Our presence is now known to them, and they will be cautious. No, we shall return tomorrow with proper preparation, and perhaps... He paused, his eyes gleaming with that fierce intelligence that Watson had come to know so well. Perhaps with reinforcements from Scotland Yard, should our preliminary investigations prove my suspicions correct. The journey back to Baker Street unfolded through a London transformed by rain into something almost dreamlike. The streets gleaming black under gaslight. Reflections stretching and distorting like memories half recalled. Holmes sat in silence during the cab ride, his fingers pressed together in that attitude of contemplation Watson had witnessed countless times. His eyes focused on some interior landscape, where facts arranged themselves into patterns, where disparate observations coalesced into understanding. The rhythmic clatter of hooves on wet cobblestones provided a steady percussion, almost meditative in its constancy, while the rain continued its gentle assault on the cab's roof, each drop a small percussion note in the larger symphony of the night. Watson found himself reflecting on what they had witnessed, the mysterious launch passing beneath the illegally opened bridge, Millwright's nocturnal documentation, the hidden passages threaded through the tower's structure like veins through living tissue. There was something profoundly unsettling about the discovery that such an iconic structure, a symbol of London's modernity and engineering prowess, harboured such secrets within its iron and stone. Yet there was also something rather thrilling about it, the recognition that beneath the surface of ordinary life, beneath the routines and assumptions of daily existence, there flowed currents of mystery and intrigue. They arrived at Baker Street near midnight, the street quiet, save for the lonely figure of a constable making his rounds, his bull's-eye lantern casting a small circle of light that moved with him like a faithful companion. Mrs. Hudson had left the sitting-room lamp burning low, a welcoming glow visible through the window, and the fire had been banked but not extinguished, ready to be coaxed back to life with minimal effort. The familiar comfort of their rooms enfolded them as they entered. The scent of old leather and older books, the the slight mustiness that came with papers and specimens stored for reference, the accumulated atmosphere of years spent in intellectual pursuit. Holmes moved immediately to his reference collection, pulling down volumes on London's shipping trade, Thames River traffic, import regulations, and customs procedures. He spread them across the table, adding to them maps showing the river's wharves and warehouses, charts indicating tidal patterns, documents detailing the bridge's operation schedules. Watson, knowing his friend would work through the night if left to his own devices, took it upon himself to rebuild the fire properly and prepare a pot of strong tea. These small domestic rituals providing a grounding counterpoint to the evening's adventures. "What are we looking for, Holmes?" Watson asked as he poured tea into their cups, the fragrant steam rising in delicate spirals, catching the lamplight. What could be valuable enough to justify such an elaborate smuggling operation? Holmes accepted the tea with an absent nod of thanks, his attention primarily on a chart showing Thames shipping routes. "Consider the constraints, Watson. Whatever they are moving must be sufficiently valuable to justify the risk and expense of corrupting bridge personnel. And make no mistake, someone among the staff must be complicit for the bascules to operate on demand. It must be items that cannot easily pass through normal customs channels, either because they are illegal, stolen, or subject to prohibitive import duties. And it must be goods that benefit from rapid, discreet transportation directly into the heart of London." He sipped his tea, the warmth of the cup seeming to focus his thoughts further. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady downpour, heavy enough to discourage casual movement through the streets, but not so fierce as to suggest a storm. The sound created a cocoon of white noise, wrapping their room in auditory privacy, separating them from the sleeping city beyond their walls. Artwork stolen from continental collections might fit the profile, Holmes continued thoughtfully, as might gemstones, rare manuscripts, certain pharmaceutical compounds, perhaps even arms destined for revolutionary movements in various troubled regions of the empire. The possibilities are numerous, but the pattern suggests organization, resources, and careful planning over an extended period. Watson settled into his chair, feeling the warmth of the fire beginning to permeate the room, driving away the damp chill they had brought in from the riverside. His mind turned over the possibilities Holmes had outlined, each one opening new avenues of speculation. The city outside continued its night routines. Somewhere a dog barked, its voice carrying through the rain-washed air. And farther away, a train whistle announced a late arrival or early departure, that mournful sound that speaks of journeys beginning and ending, of partings and reunions, of the constant motion that defines modern life. "You mentioned involving Scotland Yard," Watson said. "Should we not contact Lestrade tonight? If there is to be another shipment soon, time may be of the essence." Holmes shook his head slowly, setting down his teacup with a soft clink against the saucer. "Not yet. Lestrade is competent within his limitations, but this matter requires delicacy. We do not know the full extent of the operation, or who might be involved. A premature police intervention could scatter our quarry before we understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. No, we must gather more information first. Tomorrow, I shall make inquiries among my network of informants. There are men along the docks who know every vessel that moves on the Thames, every cargo that passes through London's waterways, legitimate or otherwise." He rose and moved to the window, drawing aside the curtain to gaze out at the rain-slicked street below. Empty now, except for the occasional hansom passing through pools of gaslight. His reflection in the glass overlaid the scene outside, creating a double image: Holmes' interior and Holmes' exterior, the man and his shadow, united in purpose, but somehow suggesting the complexity that lay beneath his precise, logical exterior. There is something else, Watson. Something about this affair that troubles me. The use of Tower Bridge is almost theatrical in its audacity. Why not use any of 100 more discrete locations along the river? Why involve such a visible, important structure when secrecy would seem paramount? Watson considered this, the question hanging in the air between them like smoke. It was a characteristic insight from Holmes, looking beyond the obvious facts to the psychological and strategic implications, asking not merely what was happening, but why it was happening in this particular manner. The fire crackled softly, a log settling and sending up a small shower of sparks that died before reaching the chimney's throat, brief lives of light consumed by darkness. Perhaps, Watson ventured, the visibility is precisely the point, a kind of hiding in plain sight, using a structure so public, so carefully monitored, that it becomes invisible as a criminal venue. Who would suspect Tower Bridge, symbol of London's modernity, as a conduit for smuggling? Holmes turned from the window, and Watson saw approval flash in those keen grey eyes. Excellent, Watson. Yes, precisely that. And more. Consider the psychological advantage of corrupting such a symbol. There is an element of contempt in it, a showing of power, the demonstration that even London's proudest achievements can be bent to serve criminal purposes. This speaks to organisation, certainly, but also to a particular mindset, arrogant, theatrical, willing to take risks for the sake of the gesture, as much as for practical benefit. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 1, its chimes seeming particularly clear in the quiet room, each note hanging in the air for a moment before fading into silence. Holmes returned to his books and papers, but Watson noticed a change in his friend's demeanour. The focused intensity remained, but there was also a quality of deep satisfaction, the pleasure of a master craftsman encountering work worthy of his skills. This was Holmes in his element, facing a puzzle that required not merely observation, but synthesis, not merely facts, but understanding. Watson allowed himself to drift slightly, his body warm from the fire, his mind pleasantly occupied with thoughts of the case, but not driven to analysis as Holmes's was. His eyes traced the familiar contours of their sitting room, the chemical apparatus standing near the window, the stack of newspapers awaiting indexing, the violin resting in its case, silent now, but capable of such expressive voice, when Holmes chose to coax music from its strings. Each object held memories, associated not merely with cases, but with the quiet moments between them, the domestic peace that formed the foundation beneath their adventures. At some point, Watson must have dozed, for he woke with a start to find grey dawnlight filtering through the curtains, and Holmes still seated at the table, surrounded by even more books and papers than before, his teacup empty, but his attention undiminished. The rain had stopped, leaving behind that peculiar clarity that comes after sustained precipitation. The air washed clean, the city revealed in sharper detail than usual. Watson could hear the morning sounds beginning, a milk cart making its rounds, the distant call of vendors in Portman Market, the general stirring of London coming awake. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice rough with sleep, "Have you been working all night?" The detective looked up, as if surprised to find he was not alone, then glanced toward the window where the growing light announced the morning's arrival. A slight smile touched his lips. "It would appear so, but not without profit, Watson. I have identified 3 shipping agents operating along the Thames who have lost cargo to mysterious accidents in the past 6 months. Crates that fell into the river during loading, shipments that were misdirected and never recovered, manifests that failed to match actual deliveries. In each case, the goods were high-value items, antiquities in one instance, uncut gems in another, rare books in the third. I believe we may be looking at a sophisticated operation that steals from legitimate shipments, then smuggles the stolen goods through Tower Bridge for resale through criminal networks." Watson rose, stretching muscles stiff from sleeping in the chair, and moved to examine the notes Holmes had compiled during the night. The detective's handwriting covered several pages, observations linked by arrows and notations, a web of connections visible only to his trained perception. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded on the stairs. She had an uncanny ability to know when they were awake, and moments later she arrived with fresh tea and the morning papers, her presence bringing warmth and normality to the room. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said, actually looking up from his work to acknowledge her, a sign of good humour and progress on the case. "Your timing, as always, is impeccable." After breakfast, which Holmes barely touched, his appetite consumed by intellectual hunger, they prepared for the day's investigations. Holmes dressed with more care than usual, selecting clothes that would allow him to move through different social strata without drawing attention, the chameleon-like quality that made him such an effective investigator. Watson cleaned and loaded his revolver, a precaution that seemed increasingly warranted given the criminal nature of what they were pursuing. "We shall visit the docks first," Holmes announced, shrugging into his coat. "There is a man named Wiggins who operates a network of street Arabs, young boys who see and hear everything that occurs along the waterfront. If anything unusual has been moving through the Thames shipping, Wiggins will know of it. Then, this afternoon, we shall pay a visit to the records office to examine the bridge's operation logs. Someone authorized that unauthorized opening last night, and their identity will be recorded, however they might try to disguise it." They descended to the street where the morning sun, pale and tentative, was beginning to break through the lingering clouds. The docks greeted them with a symphony of industry and commerce. The smell of tar and hemp rope, of fish and salt water, of coal smoke and exotic spices from distant ports. Watson had always found something compelling about London's waterfront. That zone beyond, that zone where the ordered city gave way to organised chaos, where goods from across the empire arrived and departed in constant flow, where 100 languages mingled in the shouts of stevedores and merchants. The Thames at mid-morning lay relatively calm, its surface reflecting the weak November sun in scattered patches of silver, while vessels of every description crowded against the wharves, clipper ships with their graceful lines, squat coal barges riding low in the water, steam packets belching smoke from tall funnels. Holmes moved through this environment with the assurance of long familiarity, leading Watson along narrow passages between warehouses, past coils of rope thick as a man's arm, around stacks of crates marked with mysterious symbols denoting their origins and destinations. Longshoremen worked with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated by traditions older than anyone present could remember, each man knowing his role in the complex ballet of loading and unloading that kept London's commerce flowing. The sounds created an almost musical texture, the creak of timber under strain, the splash of water against hulls, the rhythmic calls of workers coordinating their efforts, metal scraping against metal as cargo hooks engaged their loads. They found Wiggins near Wapping Old Stairs, a location where the river could be accessed directly from the street, stone steps descending into water that rose and fell with the tide's inexorable rhythm. Wiggins himself was a wiry man of indeterminate age, his face weathered by decades of outdoor work, his hands showing the calluses and scars of someone who had spent a lifetime handling rough materials. He was surrounded by a small group of boys, ranging from perhaps 8 to 14 years old, street children who survived by their wits and Wiggins's occasional employment, their sharp eyes and nimble feet making them invaluable sources of information in a city where so much commerce flowed through these waterside neighbourhoods. "Mr. Holmes," Wiggins greeted them, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of East London, vowels flattened and consonants softened by generations of Thames-side living. "Word was you might be coming round. Young Tommy here spotted you at Tower Bridge last night. Said you was observing the late opening with considerable interest." He gestured to one of the boys, a sharp-faced child with remarkably intelligent eyes, who regarded Holmes and Watson with frank curiosity. Holmes produced a coin from his pocket, flipping it to Tommy with a casual gesture that the boy caught with practiced ease. "Your powers of observation do you credit, young man. Tell me, have you witnessed other such late openings? Vessels passing through at unusual hours?" Tommy pocketed the coin with satisfaction before responding, his voice surprisingly clear despite the rough surroundings of his upbringing. "3 times in the past fortnight, sir. Always between midnight and 2 in the morning. Always small boats showing no lights, riding low like they're carrying something heavy. They come upriver from Limehouse, pass under the bridge, then continue west toward Westminster. I followed one once, running along the embankment, but lost it near the Temple when a constable chased me off for loitering." Another boy spoke up, emboldened by Tommy's success. "I seen the boats too, Mr. Holmes. They tie up sometimes at the old Savoy Pier, the one that's supposed to be closed for repairs. Men unload crates into wagons that's waiting, all quick-like. Then the boats head back downriver before dawn. The crates ain't marked with nothing, no shipping company names, no custom stamps, nothing." Holmes listened with that complete attention he gave to useful information, his mind clearly cataloguing and cross-referencing these observations with what he already knew. Watson found himself impressed, as he often was, by the network of informants Holmes had cultivated over the years. From street children to society matrons, from cab drivers to university professors, each contributing pieces to puzzles they often did not know they were helping to solve. A sharp whistle sounded from one of the ships being loaded nearby, and a heavy crate being lifted by crane suddenly swung free from its securing rope, dropping toward the dock with alarming speed. Workers scattered with shouts of warning, and the crate struck the wooden planking with a tremendous crash, splitting open to reveal its contents. Fine porcelain from China, pieces now broken into fragments, white shards scattered across the dark wood like snow. The foreman rushed over, cursing fluently in language that made even the dock workers wince. surveying the damage with evident distress. Holmes watched this commotion with apparent detachment, but Watson noticed how his friend's eyes had sharpened, his attention focusing on something Watson could not immediately identify. After a moment, Holmes moved toward the accident site, Watson following, stepping carefully around the broken porcelain. The detective crouched near the shattered crate, his fingers sifting through the wreckage with delicate precision, extracting something small that he examined closely before pocketing it with a satisfied expression. "Carelessness," the foreman was saying, his voice carrying across the dock. "Third accident this month. We're losing more goods to these mishaps than to theft, and the insurance companies are starting to ask difficult questions." Holmes straightened, approaching the foreman with his card extended. "Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective. These accidents you mention, were they similar to this? Crates falling, cargo damaged?" The foreman, a thick-set man with grey mutton-chop whiskers, examined the card before nodding slowly. "Aye, similar enough. Always high-value goods too. Not coal or timber that we can afford to lose, but expensive items, things with careful handling requirements. Started about 6 months back. We've tightened procedures, replaced worn equipment, but still they happen, almost like someone's got a curse on us." Watson could see Holmes's mind working behind his careful expression, connecting this information to the larger pattern they were investigating. The detective asked several more questions about the nature of the damaged goods, their origins, their intended destinations, his seemingly casual inquiries, extracting a remarkable amount of information from the increasingly voluble foreman. Around them, work continued. The damaged crate was cleared away. The crane operator was subjected to a thorough dressing down, and gradually the normal rhythm of the docks reasserted itself. They took their leave of Wiggins and his young associates, Holmes distributing coins with the promise of more if additional useful information surfaced. The boys scattered like sparrows, each to their own territories and observations, their eyes now alert for anything unusual involving small boats, nocturnal movements, or mysterious crates. Watson and Holmes walked along the embankment, the river flowing endlessly beside them, carrying its burden of commerce and secret both. The eternal highway that had made London great and now served both legitimate enterprise and criminal conspiracy with equal indifference. "Did you see it, Watson?" Holmes asked as they walked, his voice pitched low beneath the general dock noise. "The crate that fell, it was not an accident. The rope had been partially cut through, weakened so it would fail at a predictable point, and inside, hidden among the legitimate porcelain, were items that most certainly did not originate in China." He pulled from his pocket the object he had retrieved from the wreckage, a small carved figure, perhaps 3 inches tall, unmistakably Egyptian in style, the kind of artifact that would command substantial prices in the antiquities market. The dark stone from which it was carved gleamed dully in the grey London light, and the craftsmanship spoke of genuine age and skill, not the mass-produced tourist trinkets that flooded certain markets. Smuggled antiquities, hidden in legitimate shipments, Watson breathed, understanding flooding through him. The accidents are staged to provide access to the contraband without raising suspicion. The damaged goods are written off. The insurance companies pay for the legitimate porcelain, and the smugglers retrieve their hidden cargo from the wreckage. "Precisely," Holmes confirmed, returning the figurine to his pocket. and Tower Bridge serves as a critical control point. They can monitor incoming shipments, arrange for certain crates to be accidentally damaged during unloading, then use their nighttime operations to redistribute the recovered contraband through channels that bypass all customs scrutiny. It is elegant in its way, utilizing multiple layers of seemingly unconnected incidents to create a sophisticated smuggling network. They continued their walk, passing under the shadow of the Tower of London itself, that ancient fortress that had witnessed so much of England's history, its walls holding centuries of secrets within their massive stone embrace. Tourist parties moved through its grounds, their voices carrying faintly across the water, while ravens, the legendary guardians whose presence supposedly protected the kingdom, paced along the battlements with dignified authority. Holmes led them eventually to a tea shop tucked into a narrow street near St. Catherine Docks, a modest establishment that catered to office workers and merchants. Its windows steamed from the warmth within. They settled at a corner table, and Holmes ordered tea and sandwiches, the comforting ritual of afternoon refreshment providing a moment of normalcy amid their investigation. The tea arrived in a sturdy pot, the sandwiches simple but fresh, and for several minutes they ate in companionable silence, allowing the day's discoveries to settle into comprehensible patterns. "We need to identify who is directing this operation," Holmes said at last, refilling their cups with steady hands, the dark tea streaming into porcelain with that particular sound Watson had always found soothing. The bridge personnel who open the bascules on command, the dock workers who arrange the accidents, the buyers who purchase the smuggled goods, all of these are merely components of a larger mechanism. Someone is orchestrating this entire enterprise, coordinating multiple moving parts, maintaining discipline and secrecy across what must be dozens of participants. Watson added milk to his tea, watching it cloud and swirl, creating temporary patterns that dissolved into uniformity. Someone with resources, certainly, and connections at multiple levels, legitimate enough to have access to shipping schedules and bridge operations, criminal enough to organize theft and smuggling on this scale. "Indeed," Holmes agreed, his eyes distant, seeing connections Watson could only dimly perceive. "This afternoon, we shall examine those operational logs at the bridge. Tonight—" He paused, a slight smile touching his lips. "Tonight, I believe we shall pay another visit to Tower Bridge, but this time we shall explore those lower chambers more thoroughly." Afternoon light filtered through tall windows of the bridge operations office, casting elongated rectangles across floors, worn smooth by year-cross floors, worn smooth by years of official footsteps. The room smelled of ink and leather, of oil lamps, and the faint metallic tang that seemed to permeate everything connected with the bridge's machinery. Ledgers lined the walls in orderly ranks, their spines labelled with dates stretching back to the bridge's opening, each volume a chronicle of every vessel passage, every bascule operation, every routine and exceptional event in the structure's brief but industrious life. Holmes and Watson had been granted access through Cartwright's increasingly worried authorization, the engineer having grown more agitated as the implications of the smuggling operation became clearer to him. A clerk worked at a high desk near the window, his pen scratching steadily across pages of current logs, recording the day's legitimate bridge operations with the methodical precision of someone who found comfort in routine and accuracy. He was a young man, perhaps 25, with spectacles that caught the light when he glanced up occasionally. and ink stains on his fingers that spoke of long hours spent in documentation. The sound of his pen provided a gentle rhythm, counterpoint to the distant rumble of traffic crossing the bridge below, the muffled thunder of cartwheels and hooves on the roadway that never entirely ceased during daylight hours. Holmes had positioned himself at a reading table with the logs from the past 3 months spread before him, his eyes moving rapidly across entries, absorbing information with that remarkable capacity for detail retention that made him such an effective investigator. Watson sat nearby, ostensibly reviewing an earlier volume, but primarily watching his friend work, recognizing the signs of Holmes approaching a critical revelation. The slight tension in his shoulders, the increased focus of his gaze, the way his fingers would occasionally tap against the table's edge in unconscious calculation. Outside the window, clouds were gathering again, promising another night of rain, the sky taking on that particular leaden quality that comes with sustained weather systems settling over the city. A barge passed beneath the bridge, its horn sounding with melancholy insistence, requesting passage but not requiring the bascules to open. The vessel's masts were low enough to clear the roadway span without difficulty. Gulls wheeled above the river, their cries carrying faintly through the glass, those eternal scavengers that followed the Thames, hoping for discarded fish or other edible refuse. "Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice barely audible, pitched to avoid drawing the clerk's attention. "Come look at this." Watson rose and moved to stand behind Holmes, following his friend's pointing finger to a series of entries in the operational log. Each entry recorded the date and time of a bridge opening, the vessel that had requested passage, the authorization for the operation, and the personnel who had executed it. The entries themselves appeared entirely routine and proper, official forms filled out correctly, appropriate signatures in all required locations, nothing to immediately suggest irregularity. But Holmes's finger moved across the page, indicating subtle patterns Watson would never have noticed without guidance. "Here, and here, and here," Holmes whispered. 3 late-night openings over the past month, each authorized by the same supervisor, a man named Cornelius Marsh, Assistant Operations Manager. But notice the vessels recorded as requesting passage. The descriptions are vague, lacking the specific details present in all other entries. Steam launch, commercial, rather than the actual vessel name, registration, cargo manifest reference. And the times, always between midnight and 2 in the morning, precisely when legitimate traffic would be minimal and observation difficult. Watson studied the entries more closely, seeing now what Holmes had immediately perceived. The slight but significant deviations from standard procedure that suggested these operations existed in a different category from the routine bridge openings that filled the rest of the logs. The handwriting was consistent, the forms technically correct, but there was a quality of deliberate vagueness that became apparent once you knew to look for it. "This Cornelius Marsh," Watson said softly. "Can we interview him?" Holmes closed the ledger carefully, his expression thoughtful. "We can certainly try, though I suspect Mr. Marsh will prove either unavailable or remarkably forgetful when confronted with questions about these particular operations. But his name gives us a thread to pull, and threads, when pulled with sufficient persistence, often unravel entire tapestries." They thanked the clerk and departed the operations office, emerging once more into the grey afternoon, the temperature dropping noticeably as evening approached. The bridge rose before them, solid and permanent seeming, despite the temporary nature of all human constructions, its towers dark against the darkening sky. Holmes stood for a moment, gazing up at the structure, his mind clearly working through implications and possibilities, constructing scenarios and testing them against known facts. A commotion near the bridge's southern approach drew their attention. Raised voices, the sound of something heavy being dragged across cobblestones, a horse whinnying in distress. They moved toward the disturbance to find a delivery wagon had lost a wheel, its cargo of wine barrels now scattered across the roadway, several having broken open to stain the stones with dark red liquid that looked disturbingly like blood in the fading light. The driver was arguing with a constable about moving the obstruction, while passers-by stopped to observe the spectacle with that mixture of sympathy and entertainment that London crowds brought to minor disasters. Holmes waded into the confusion with surprising decisiveness, organizing several onlookers to help clear the roadway, his natural authority causing people to respond without questioning. Watson joined the effort, helping to roll intact barrels to the side of the road, his medical training making him instinctively check that no one had been injured in the accident. The work was physical and grounding, a reminder that beneath all mystery and investigation lay the simple reality of bodies in motion, of problems requiring straightforward solutions, of cooperation and effort producing tangible results. As they helped right the wagon onto its 3 remaining wheels, Watson noticed Holmes examining the broken wheel with particular attention, his fingers tracing the fracture pattern, his eyes noting details invisible to casual observation. When the immediate crisis had been managed and the roadway cleared, Holmes drew Watson aside, his voice low and urgent. "The wheel did not break naturally, Watson. Look here." He indicated a section of the wooden hub where the spokes had failed. This was weakened deliberately, sawn partially through, so it would fail at a predictable point. Another accident, like those at the docks, but this time targeting a wine shipment. Before Watson could respond, a man approached them from the gathering crowd. Middle-aged, well-dressed in the manner of a prosperous merchant, his face showing concern and something else. Something that might have been fear carefully controlled. "Gentlemen, I could not help but overhear your observation. I am Edmund Blackwell, proprietor of Blackwell Fine Wines and Spirits. That wagon is mine, or rather, was transporting goods from my warehouse. This is the 3rd such incident in as many weeks. Carts losing wheels, delivery men being robbed at knife point, shipments mysteriously disappearing between warehouse and customer. I am being systematically destroyed, and I do not understand why." Holmes's attention sharpened immediately. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwell, do you import goods from the continent? Wines from France? Perhaps spirits from other regions?" Blackwell nodded, confusion evident on his features. "Of course, that is the nature of my business, but all my imports are entirely legitimate, properly documented, customs duties paid in full. I have operated for 15 years without the slightest irregularity. Why would anyone target my business specifically?" "Perhaps," Holmes said gently, "because someone wishes to use your legitimate shipments as cover for their own illegitimate activities. Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual about your recent imports? Crates that seemed heavier or lighter than expected? Packing materials disturbed? Seals broken and reapplied?" The merchant's face went pale as understanding began to dawn. "Good Lord," You think someone has been hiding contraband in my shipments, using my business, my reputation, as camouflage for smuggling? His voice rose slightly with agitation, and Watson instinctively placed a steadying hand on the man's arm. "It is a possibility we must consider," Holmes replied. "And if true, it would explain why your operations are being disrupted. Not to destroy your business per se, but to provide opportunities for retrieving hidden contraband from your legitimate cargo. The accidents create confusion during which certain items can be extracted and substituted without detection." A church bell tolled the hour. 5 o'clock, the sound rolling across the riverside neighborhoods, marking the day's progression toward evening. The sky had grown darker still, and the first drops of new rain began to fall. Individual drops at first, then gradually increasing, that familiar London rain that seemed to define the season, endless and gentle, and somehow comforting in its persistence. The crowd that had gathered for the wagon accident began to disperse, people hurrying toward shelter, collars turned up against the weather. Holmes gave Blackwell his card, extracting a promise that the merchant would contact him immediately if anything further unusual occurred. They parted with mutual expressions of concern and determination, Blackwell heading off to deal with his damaged cargo, while Holmes and Watson found shelter in a nearby tavern, a modest establishment that catered to bridge workers and rivermen, its interior warm and dim, and filled with the comfortable smell of beer and pipe tobacco. They settled at a table near the fire, ordering pints of bitter that arrived in heavy glass mugs, the foam settling slowly as they sat in silence for a moment, processing the day's accumulation of information. Around them, working men conducted quiet conversations, the rumble of voices creating a backdrop of human community, of shared labour and simple pleasures, the eternal rhythms of working-class London that had sustained the city through centuries. "The pattern grows clearer," Holmes said at last, his voice barely audible above the tavern's ambient sound. Multiple legitimate businesses being exploited as unknowing accomplices in a sophisticated smuggling network. The contraband is hidden within regular shipments, then extracted through staged accidents and disruptions. Tower Bridge serves as both a choke point for monitoring incoming goods and a distribution hub for redirecting stolen items. It is remarkably comprehensive in its scope. Watson sipped his bitter, feeling the day's exertions catching up with him, a pleasant weariness settling into his muscles. But we still do not know who is orchestrating this operation. This Cornelius Marsh may be involved, but surely he is not the mastermind. Someone of greater resources and connections must be directing the enterprise. Indeed, Holmes agreed, his fingers drumming lightly against his mug in that gesture of contained energy that indicated his mind was racing ahead, formulating plans and strategies. Tonight, when we return to the bridge, we must penetrate deeper into its lower chambers. Night descended over the Thames, like a curtain drawn across a stage, transforming the familiar geography of daylight into something mysterious and charged with possibility. Holmes and Watson departed the tavern shortly after 7, merging with the evening crowds that still moved through the streets. Despite the rain, clerks heading home after long days in counting houses, shopgirls hurrying toward omnibus stops, street vendors making final sales before seeking their own shelter. The city's transition from commerce to domesticity unfolded around them, gaslights creating pools of amber illumination that barely held back the encroaching darkness, while above, no stars penetrated the thick cloud cover that blanketed London in protective obscurity. They approached Tower Bridge from the east this time, moving through the warren of lanes and alleys that crowded against the river's edge, past boarding houses where sailors, between voyages, took cheap lodging, past taverns that catered to rougher clientele than the establishment where they had taken their bitter. The air here carried different scents: fish and rope, coal smoke, and human habitation pressed close together. The sharp metallic smell of the river mixing with cooking odours from a dozen different cuisines, representing the cosmopolitan nature of London's docklands. Watson found himself grateful for his military experience, which had taught him to move comfortably through environments far rougher than these streets. Though he noticed Holmes seemed equally at ease, his ability to blend into any social stratum serving them well in their approach. The bridge rose before them, its towers dark silhouettes against the marginally lighter sky, the structure seeming almost to breathe in the rain-swept darkness, alive with purpose and presence. No light showed in the walkways now. Those glass corridors remained dark, suspended between earth and clouds, connecting the towers across emptiness. But Watson thought he detected movement there, fleeting shadows that might have been imagination, or might have been watchers, ensuring that the coast remained clear for whatever activities were planned for tonight. Holmes had brought tools, a dark lantern that could be shuttered to near invisibility, a set of picks for locks that might impede their progress, rope in case climbing became necessary. Watson carried his revolver and a small bullseye lantern of his own, feeling that familiar tightening of nerves that preceded action, the shift from observation to engagement that his military service had conditioned into instinct. They moved with careful silence, avoiding the main entrances where guards might be posted, instead approaching the maintenance access Millwright had mentioned, a service door tucked beneath the southern approach, easily overlooked unless one knew to search for it. The lock yielded to Holmes's picks with surprising ease, suggesting it had been opened regularly and recently, its mechanism worn smooth by repeated use. They slipped inside, closing the door softly behind them, suddenly enclosed in darkness, broken only by the faint glow from their shuttered lanterns. The air here was cooler, carrying that particular underground quality of spaces seldom touched by daylight or ventilation, smelling of stone and old metal, of condensation and the ever-present proximity of the river seeping through the foundation. The passage led them downward through spaces Watson had not known existed within the bridge's structure, service corridors running beneath the roadway, maintenance tunnels providing access to the hydraulic systems, storage chambers where equipment and spare parts were kept against future need. The walls wept with condensation, and their footsteps, though carefully placed, echoed softly in the confined spaces, each sound magnified by the acoustic properties of stone and metal. Watson found himself holding his breath at intervals, listening for any indication that their presence had been detected, but heard only the ambient sounds of the structure itself, the drip of water, the occasional groan of stressed materials, the muffled rumble of late traffic crossing the roadway far above their heads. Holmes led them deeper into the bridge's foundations, following some internal map constructed from Cartwright's descriptions and his own observations, navigating with the confidence of someone who had already visualized the route in his mind. They passed through a chamber filled with the massive counterweights that balanced the bascules, great blocks of concrete and iron suspended in perfect equilibrium, tons of mass held in check by the engineering genius that made the bridge functional. The scale of it was humbling. These weights, when the bridge opened, would descend into pits that ran deep beneath the riverbed, their movement so carefully calculated that the roadway could be raised with minimal expenditure of energy. A sound reached them from ahead. Voices, indistinct but clearly human, accompanied by scraping and the occasional metallic clang that suggested activity involving tools or heavy objects being moved. Holmes extinguished his lantern completely, and Watson followed suit, plunging them into absolute darkness. They stood motionless, allowing their eyes to adjust, waiting as slowly the darkness resolved into gradations of shadow, faint light seeping from somewhere ahead, showing as a barely perceptible glow against the tunnel walls. Moving with exquisite care, they advanced toward the light and sound. Watson's hand resting on his revolver, though he had not drawn it, Holmes proceeding with that peculiar gliding step that allowed him to move almost soundlessly, despite the echoing nature of their surroundings. The passage opened into a larger chamber, one of the hydraulic machinery rooms that powered the bridge's operation. Here, the engineering that made Tower Bridge function revealed itself in all its industrial magnificence. Massive rams and pistons, pipes thick as tree trunks, pressure gauges and valves arranged in precise patterns. The whole system ready to spring into life at command and raise the roadway above in smooth ascent. But Watson's attention fixed not on the machinery, but on the activity occurring within the chamber. 4 men worked by the light of shuttered lanterns, their faces shadowed, but their purpose clear. They were opening crates stacked against the far wall, extracting items and repacking them into smaller containers. Watson caught glimpses of what was being transferred. More Egyptian artifacts, like the one Holmes had found in the damaged porcelain crate, small statues and carved reliefs, pieces of jewelry that gleamed gold and lapis in the lamplight, antiquities stolen from tombs and temples, now being prepared for distribution into London's black market for such treasures. The men worked with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated by long familiarity with the task. One called out softly to another, "Mind the scarab collection. Those are worth a fortune to the right buyer," his voice carrying clearly in the chamber's acoustics. Another laughed quietly at some comment Watson could not hear. The sound intimate and relaxed, suggesting these men felt safe here in the bridge's depths, confident in the secrecy of their operations. At that moment, the bridge's warning bells began to sound, the signal that the bascules were about to open, that a vessel was requesting passage. The men in the chamber reacted immediately, moving with sudden urgency, one rushing to a speaking tube set in the wall, calling up to someone above. "Tell Marsh we need another 10 minutes. Keep the bridge closed until we finish transferring this batch." The response came faintly down the tube, indistinct words, but a tone of acknowledgement and compliance. Holmes touched Watson's arm in the darkness, a signal to remain still and silent. But Watson felt his friend's tension, the coiled readiness that indicated Holmes was calculating options, considering the moment for intervention. They were outnumbered in an unfamiliar space, with no clear avenue of retreat should things go wrong. Yet here, before them, was the proof they needed. The smuggling operation caught in the act, the stolen antiquities being processed for distribution, the conspiracy involving bridge personnel, confirmed by the direct communication with Marsh. One of the men separated from the group, moving toward the passage where Holmes and Watson concealed themselves in shadow, heading apparently for another storage area, or perhaps to relieve himself. He carried a lantern, its light growing stronger as he approached, and Watson felt his muscles tense, preparing for the confrontation that now seemed inevitable. The man was whistling softly, some popular music hall tune, completely unsuspecting, as he walked directly toward their hiding place. The lantern light pushing back the darkness, about to reveal their presence in sudden and dramatic fashion. Holmes moved first, stepping forward into the man's path, his voice cutting through the darkness with the command of absolute authority. "Stop where you are. We are investigating a smuggling operation, and you are caught quite literally in the act. I suggest you cooperate fully if you wish to avoid the most serious consequences." The man's face registered shock, his lantern dropping from nerveless fingers to clatter against the stone floor, the glass breaking with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. His shout of alarm brought the others running, and suddenly the chamber erupted into confused action. Men grabbing weapons, lanterns swinging wildly, creating disorienting patterns of light and shadow, voices raised in anger and warning. Watson drew his revolver, stepping to Holmes's side, his military training taking over, assessing threats and angles of fire, positioning himself to provide covering support for his friend while seeking advantage in what had become a genuinely dangerous situation. "There's no escape," Holmes called out, his voice remarkably calm despite the circumstances. "The police are being summoned as we speak, and you are trapped within this structure with no viable exit. Your only sensible course is immediate surrender." This was not strictly true. They had not arranged for police backup, a fact Watson recognized with some concern. But Holmes had always possessed the ability to project absolute certainty, to make his statements carry such conviction that they became effectively true through sheer force of presence. The smugglers hesitated, clearly weighing their options. Hands on weapons, but not yet committed to violence. The moment balanced on a knife's edge between confrontation and capitulation. The decision came not from the smugglers, but from an unexpected source. A sharp whistle echoed through the tunnel system, followed by running footsteps from multiple directions. The unmistakable sound of reinforcements arriving. But these were not police, as Holmes's bluff had suggested. Instead, more men emerged from passages Watson had not noticed, a coordinated response that spoke of preparation and organization far exceeding what they had anticipated. The smugglers were not merely criminals caught in the act. They were part of a well-drilled operation, with contingencies planned for exactly this type of interference. Holmes's expression shifted subtly. Not fear, exactly, but a recalibration of assessment, the recognition that they had stumbled into something larger and more dangerous than their preliminary investigation had suggested. Watson felt his finger tighten on the revolver's trigger, his heartbeat steady despite the adrenaline, his mind automatically counting the new arrivals, assessing which posed the most immediate threat, calculating angles and distances with the precision that years of military service had ingrained into muscle memory and instinct. "Gentlemen," a new voice called from the shadows, cultured and educated, carrying none of the rough edges of the working men who had been packing the antiquities. "Please, there is no need for firearms or violence. I believe we can discuss this situation in a more civilized manner. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, if you would be so kind as to lower your weapon and accompany me, I can offer explanations that may surprise you. The speaker emerged into the lamplight, and Watson felt shock course through him. The man was perhaps 50 years old, distinguished in appearance, wearing evening dress beneath a heavy overcoat, clearly someone of education and social standing. More significantly, Watson recognized him from newspaper illustrations and society pages. Sir Marcus Pendleton, respected antiquarian, benefactor of the British Museum, author of several well-regarded volumes on Egyptian archaeology, a man whose reputation seemed utterly incompatible with criminal enterprise. Holmes, however, showed no surprise whatsoever. Instead, a slight smile touched his lips, that expression of satisfaction that came when a complex puzzle's final pieces clicked into place. "Sir Marcus," he said calmly, as if they were meeting at a gentleman's club rather than in the depths of Tower Bridge surrounded by smugglers. "I had begun to suspect that only someone with your particular combination of expertise, connections, and resources could orchestrate an operation of this sophistication. Tell me, how long have you been systematically looting Egypt's antiquities for personal profit, while maintaining your public facade of scholarly concern for their preservation?" Sir Marcus gestured toward a side chamber, where several chairs had been arranged around a makeshift desk. Clearly, this space served as some kind of operational headquarters for the smuggling ring. "Please, sit. I insist. Your revolver will be unnecessary, Dr. Watson. My men have orders not to harm you, unless you make such action unavoidable. I would much prefer conversation to confrontation." Watson glanced at Holmes, who gave the slightest nod of assent. Against every instinct developed through years of facing danger, Watson lowered his revolver, though he did not return it to his pocket. They moved into the indicated chamber, the smugglers maintaining watchful positions, but not actively threatening. The space was surprisingly comfortable. Someone had gone to considerable effort to create a functional office deep within the bridge's foundations, complete with filing cabinets, a substantial desk covered with papers and ledgers, even a small stove that provided warmth against the perpetual dampness. Sir Marcus settled into a chair behind the desk with the ease of someone entirely comfortable with his surroundings and circumstances. He poured 3 glasses of brandy from a crystal decanter, offering 2 to Holmes and Watson with the graciousness of a host entertaining guests. The entire situation had taken on a surreal quality. The elegant scholar presiding over criminal operations in this underground lair, the juxtaposition of cultured manner and illicit activity, creating cognitive dissonance that Watson struggled to reconcile. "You must understand," Sir Marcus began, swirling his brandy thoughtfully, "that I am not merely a common thief motivated by greed. I am engaged in rescue operations, preserving antiquities that would otherwise be destroyed by the Egyptian government's careless administration, or lost to far less scrupulous dealers than myself. The items you see here represent treasures that will ultimately find their way to private collections, where they will be properly cared for, studied, preserved for future generations." Holmes accepted the brandy, but did not drink, instead holding the glass up to catch the lamplight, examining the amber liquid as if it might contain clues to Sir Marcus's character and motivations. "A fascinating rationalization," he observed dryly. "I am certain the families whose tombs you plunder would appreciate your concern for preservation, as would the Egyptian people whose cultural heritage you are systematically stealing. Tell me, does the British Museum know that their respected benefactor is conducting private excavations that violate every international agreement regarding archaeological sites? A flicker of something, anger or perhaps wounded pride, crossed Sir Marcus's features before his composed expression reasserted itself. The British Museum is a monument to cultural imperialism, Mr. Holmes. They acquire antiquities through official channels that are themselves merely legitimized theft, government-sanctioned looting dressed in diplomatic language. I simply operate with more honesty about the nature of the enterprise, and I provide these treasures to collectors who genuinely appreciate them, rather than locking them in museum basements where they gather dust unseen for decades. The philosophical discussion continued, taking on the character of a debate between scholars rather than a confrontation between detective and criminal. Watson found himself oddly mesmerized by the conversation, by Sir Marcus's articulate defense of activities that were clearly illegal, yet presented with such conviction that they took on a strange moral ambiguity. The chamber's warmth, the brandy's aroma, the sound of rain continuing somewhere far above, all combined to create an atmosphere almost dreamlike in quality, as if they had descended not merely into the bridge's physical foundations, but into some liminal space where normal rules and categories ceased to apply with their usual certainty. Holmes listened with apparent patience, occasionally asking questions that prompted Sir Marcus to elaborate on the network he had constructed. The contacts in Egypt who facilitated illegal excavations, the shipping companies whose legitimate cargo provided cover for contraband, the corrupt officials who looked the other way in exchange for generous payments, the private collectors across Europe and America who paid astronomical prices for artifacts that could never be displayed publicly, but remained hidden treasures in private galleries. And Cornelius Marsh? Holmes inquired. How did you secure his cooperation in operating Tower Bridge at your convenience? Sir Marcus smiled, an expression that carried genuine warmth, suggesting he bore no animosity despite their adversarial positions. Poor Marsh. He accumulated gambling debts, you see, rather substantial ones, to individuals who do not accept default gracefully. I paid his debts and recruited his services in exchange. He opens the bridge when I require passage, ensures that certain officials are not present during our operations, maintains the fiction that all activities are entirely routine and authorized. A simple arrangement, really, beneficial to all parties involved. Except, Watson interjected, unable to remain silent any longer, to the people of Egypt, to the legitimate authorities trying to protect cultural heritage, to the merchants whose businesses you disrupt with staged accidents, to the principle of law itself. Your scholarly credentials do not excuse theft on a massive scale, Sir Marcus, regardless of how you choose to rationalize it. The antiquarian turned his attention to Watson, his expression showing genuine interest rather than offense. Well said, Doctor. I see you are not merely Mr. Holmes's chronicler, but a man of firm moral principles. I respect that, truly. But consider, what is ownership when applied to objects 3,000 years old? The pharaohs who commissioned these pieces are dust. The civilization that created them has vanished utterly. They belong to no one and to everyone. I am not stealing from anyone with a legitimate claim. I am redistributing artifacts that would otherwise moulder in government warehouses, or, worse, be destroyed by religious extremists who view them as pagan abominations. A sudden metallic grinding filled the chamber, the sound of the bridge's bascule mechanism activating. The floor beneath them trembled slightly as hundreds of tons of counterweights began their descent. The roadway above, rising to allow passage for whatever vessel had requested access. The timing seemed significant, and Watson saw Holmes's eyes narrow, his mind clearly working through implications. "You are expecting a delivery tonight," Holmes stated flatly. "That is why you detained us here with philosophical discussion, rather than simply disposing of us. You need to ensure that your incoming shipment clears the bridge without police interference. What is arriving, Sir Marcus? What could be so valuable that you risk exposure by bringing it through tonight, despite knowing we have discovered your operation?" Sir Marcus's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold calculation. "The Amenhotep sarcophagus lid, Mr. Holmes. 18th dynasty, decorated with gold leaf and semi-precious stones, inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead. It was discovered 3 months ago by my team in the Valley of the Kings, in a previously unknown tomb. The Egyptian authorities do not yet know of its existence, and it will be sold to an American collector for a sum that exceeds the annual budget of most British museums. It arrives tonight aboard a vessel registered to a wholly legitimate shipping company, hidden within a cargo of machine parts supposedly bound for a Manchester factory. And once it passes beneath Tower Bridge," Holmes continued, his voice showing the first hint of emotion, satisfaction mixed with determination, "it will be transferred to your distribution network, dispersed through channels you have established, transformed from a priceless artifact of human history into merely another commodity in your ledgers of stolen property." The bridge mechanism continued its operation, the grinding and groaning filling the underground chambers with sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the voice of the great structure performing its function oblivious to the drama unfolding within its depths. Through the speaking tube on Sir Marcus's desk came a voice, faint but clear. "Vessel approaching, 5 minutes to passage." Sir Marcus stood, his relaxed demeanour replaced by brisk authority. "I am afraid, gentlemen, that you will need to remain here as my guests until the transfer is complete. Afterward, we can discuss what arrangements might be made. I bear you no ill will, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. You are simply inconvenient at this particular moment. In a few hours, once the sarcophagus lid is safely secured, perhaps we can reach an understanding that serves all our interests." Watson felt tension returning to his muscles, the philosophical interlude ending, and immediate danger reasserting itself. 2 of Sir Marcus's men moved to positions blocking the chamber's exit, their presence making clear that guests was merely a polite euphemism for prisoners. Holmes remained seated, apparently calm, but Watson knew his friend well enough to recognize the subtle signs of furious mental activity. Wheels turning behind that high forehead, calculating possibilities and probabilities, searching for the advantage that would shift this situation back under their control. Outside, somewhere in the rainy London night, a vessel carrying looted treasure approached Tower Bridge, its passage already authorized by corrupted officials, its cargo destined for criminal networks that stretched across continents. And here, deep beneath the Thames, 2 men who had dedicated themselves to justice sat trapped by circumstance and careful planning, surrounded by evidence of crimes that touched museums and tombs, legitimate commerce and ancient history, the past and present, woven together in a tapestry of theft conducted with scholarly precision and ruthless efficiency. Time seemed to elongate in that underground chamber, each minute stretching with the peculiar elasticity that comes when waiting becomes its own form of action. The bridge mecha its own form of action. The bridge mechanism had completed its cycle, the bascules now raised high above the Thames, creating passage for the vessel that carried Sir Marcus's latest acquisition from Egypt's plundered past. Watson could hear the distant throb of a steam engine, muffled by stone and water, but growing steadily louder. The approach of the ship that would either cement the smuggling ring's success or provide the opportunity Holmes was surely calculating. The detective sat motionless in his chair, the brandy still untouched in his hand, his eyes half closed in what might have appeared to be resigned acceptance, but which Watson recognized as intense concentration. Sir Marcus had returned to his desk, consulting papers, and occasionally speaking into the tube that connected this underground office to the bridge operations above. The smugglers maintained their positions, watchful but not actively threatening, men doing a job they had done many times before, confident in their routine and their leader's planning. Then Holmes spoke, his voice carrying across the chamber, with that particular quality of observation that preceded revelation. Tell me, Sir Marcus, in your study of Egyptian burial practices, have you encountered the concept of Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, order? The ancient Egyptians believed that the universe functioned through balance, that disorder and deception were not merely immoral, but violations of cosmic law. Rather ironic, is it not, that you steal from a culture so profoundly concerned with truth and balance, while maintaining such elaborate deceptions in your own life? Sir Marcus looked up from his papers, his expression showing curiosity rather than offence. An interesting philosophical point, Mr. Holmes. But the ancient Egyptians also believed that the afterlife could be secured through proper burial with sufficient treasure. They filled tombs with gold and jewels, not from aesthetic appreciation, but from theological terror. I liberate these objects from superstition and place them in contexts where they can be studied and appreciated rationally. Perhaps, Holmes replied, his tone almost conversational. But you have made one critical error in your otherwise admirable planning. You see, before we entered the bridge tonight, I took the precaution of sending a telegram to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard, providing him with detailed information about your operations, and requesting that he position officers at strategic points around Tower Bridge. He should be in place by now, waiting for precisely this moment, when your vessel arrives and your confederates expose themselves through action. Sir Marcus's composure finally cracked, his face showing alarm before he could control his expression. You are bluffing, Mr. Holmes. You had no time to send such a telegram, and you could not have known you would find me here tonight. Holmes smiled then, that expression of triumph that came when years of deductive reasoning and careful observation produced the desired result. On the contrary, I sent the telegram this afternoon from the post office near St. Catherine Docks after our conversation with Mr. Blackwell. I did not know I would encounter you specifically tonight, but I knew that whoever directed this operation would need to be present for a shipment as valuable as you have described. And I knew that Tower Bridge, with its limited access points and its position spanning the Thames, would become a trap rather than an asset once sufficient police resources were positioned correctly. The sound of whistles carried down from above. Police whistles, multiple officers signalling to one another, coordinating their movements. Sir Marcus's face went pale, and his men exchanged nervous glances, their confidence evaporating as they realized their escape routes were being systematically closed. Through the speaking tube came panicked voices. Police everywhere. They're blocking the approaches. The vessel is being boarded. What followed unfolded with the inevitability of a carefully constructed logical proof reaching its conclusion. Sir Marcus's organization, so carefully built over years of planning and execution, collapsed within hours as police swept through the bridge's hidden spaces, arresting smugglers and corrupt officials, seizing ledgers and artifacts, dismantling the network piece by piece. The vessel carrying the Amenhotep sarcophagus lid was impounded at the bridge, its crew detained, its illicit cargo discovered hidden precisely where Holmes had predicted, within crates marked as industrial machinery. Holmes and Watson emerged from the bridge's depths as dawn began to break over London, the rain having finally ceased, leaving behind a city washed clean and glistening in the pale morning light. Inspector Lestrade met them on the bridge's roadway, his face showing satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. A good night's work completed successfully. "Remarkable, Mr. Holmes," the inspector said, pumping Holmes's hand with enthusiasm. "We've recovered antiquities worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. Sir Marcus Pendleton, of all people, who would have suspected such a respected scholar of operating a criminal enterprise on this scale?" Holmes accepted the praise with characteristic modesty, deflecting credit to the various informants and assistants who had contributed pieces to the puzzle, though Watson knew the synthesis of those pieces into coherent understanding had been entirely his friend's achievement. They walked slowly away from the bridge as the sun climbed higher, its light beginning to penetrate the morning mist rising from the Thames, transforming the river into something magical and mysterious, a ribbon of gold running through the heart of the city. The ghosts of Tower Bridge, Watson mused as they walked, proved to be rather more corporeal than Mr. Cartwright feared. Men engaged in very earthly crimes, using shadows and misdirection to create an atmosphere of supernatural mystery. As is so often the case, Holmes agreed, his voice carrying that note of philosophical reflection that sometimes emerged after a case's conclusion. Humanity's capacity for deception is remarkable, Watson. We construct elaborate facades, we manipulate perception, we create entire alternative realities to serve our purposes. Sir Marcus genuinely believed his own rationalizations, convinced himself that theft could be transformed into preservation through scholarly justification. The human mind's ability to excuse its own actions is perhaps the greatest mystery of all. They continued their walk through streets now filling with London's morning life, shops opening, workers beginning their days, the great city stirring itself from sleep and resuming its endless cycle of commerce and conversation, labour and leisure. The bridge behind them stood solid and permanent against the brightening sky, its secrets now revealed, its hidden passages and chambers returned to legitimate use. The temporary disorder resolved back into proper order. In the days that followed, Watson would write up the case for his chronicle of Holmes's investigations, though certain details would need to be obscured to protect ongoing prosecutions and diplomatic sensitivities. The recovered antiquities would eventually be returned to Egypt through official channels, a gesture of goodwill that helped smooth relationships strained by the revelation of how systematically British citizens had been looting that ancient land's heritage. Sir Marcus Pendleton's reputation lay in ruins, his scholarly works now viewed with suspicion, his name becoming synonymous with hypocrisy and criminal sophistication. But on that morning, walking through London as the city awakened, Holmes and Watson simply enjoyed the satisfaction of justice served and mystery illuminated. They stopped at a small cafe for breakfast, the smell of fresh bread and strong coffee welcoming them inside, and sat by the window, watching the street fill with humanity, pursuing its 10,000 different purposes, each person carrying their own stories and secrets, their hopes and deceptions, their small triumphs and quiet desperations. "You know, Holmes," Watson said as they finished their meal, "I have often wondered what drives you to pursue these investigations. Not for money, certainly. You frequently take cases for clients who can barely afford your services. Not for fame, though your reputation grows with each successful resolution. What then? What makes you dedicate yourself so completely to illuminating truth and pursuing justice?" Holmes was silent for a long moment, gazing out at the passing crowds, his expression thoughtful and unguarded in a way he rarely allowed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an unusual softness, almost vulnerability. "I suppose, Watson, it is because the universe tends toward entropy, toward disorder and confusion. Truth becomes obscured, justice becomes perverted, clarity gives way to obscurity, and yet, through careful observation and logical reasoning, through persistent questioning and refusal to accept easy answers, one can occasionally push back that darkness, restore a small measure of order, bring light to places where shadow had seemed permanent. It is not much, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but it is something, and something, when done with care and dedication, is infinitely better than nothing." They finished their breakfast in comfortable silence, then made their way back to Baker Street, through morning sunshine that felt like benediction after days of rain. Mrs. Hudson greeted them with expressions of relief. She had been worried by their late absence, and soon had tea and fresh scones waiting in their sitting room. The familiar comfort of home enfolded them, the fire crackling in the grate, the morning newspapers waiting to be read, the normal rhythms of domestic life providing gentle counterpoint to the drama and danger that had preceded this peaceful morning. And somewhere across London, Tower Bridge stood watch over the Thames, its towers rising toward heaven, its mechanisms poised to lift the roadway when vessels required passage, its hidden chambers now returned to their proper purposes. The bridge had weathered this temporary corruption and emerged unchanged, solid and permanent, a monument to engineering and human ambition, connecting the banks of the great river that had sustained London since before memory, that would continue flowing long after everyone involved in this night's drama had passed into history and memory. The city breathed and lived, its millions of inhabitants pursuing their countless purposes, most of them never knowing of the smuggling ring that had operated beneath one of their most iconic structures, never aware of how close they had come to seeing a piece of their built heritage transformed permanently into a conduit for criminal enterprise. Life continued, as it always did, the vast organism of London absorbing and accommodating, adapting and persisting through whatever challenges arose. And in a quiet sitting room in Baker Street, two friends sat in companionable silence, grateful for each other's presence, satisfied with work well done, ready for whatever new mystery might present itself, when the world next required their particular combination of observation, deduction, and courage in the service of truth. If you enjoyed this journey through Victorian London and the mystery of Tower Bridge, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories like this into the world, more journeys into mystery and wonder, more opportunities to slow down and drift into peaceful sleep, surrounded by tales of bygone days and atmospheric intrigue. Thank you for spending this time with me, for allowing Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson to accompany you toward rest and dreams. And now, dear friend, as the story concludes and London settles into its eternal rhythms, I wish you the most peaceful of nights. May your sleep be deep and restorative, your dreams pleasant and gentle. May you wake refreshed, carrying with you perhaps a small sense of the wonder and mystery that lurks beneath the surface of ordinary things, waiting to be discovered by those with eyes to see and minds willing to question. Good night, and thank you for being here.